There was once a civilization, powerful beyond imagination, far more advanced than the world around it. Its cities were alive. Its people understood things others could not, and its influence stretched across vast lands. And then it was gone. No final battle, no great disaster recorded, no explanation left behind. Just silence. Entire cities left untouched. Homes still standing. Lives suddenly paused in time. It was as if an entire world simply stepped away from history. Even today, experts continue to search for answers, but the deeper they look, the stranger the mystery becomes. Because this wasn't just a fall, it was a disappearance. And the truth is, we may never truly know what happened. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this from? And what time is it in your city right now? The world they built, long before the world we know today. Before borders, before empires were written into history, there existed a civilization that should not have been possible, not for its time, not with what we believe humans were capable of, and yet it was real. Their cities were not chaotic clusters of survival. They were engineered, perfectly aligned streets, drainage systems so advanced that even some modern cities struggled to match them until recently. Water flowed exactly where it needed to go. Waste disappeared without spreading disease. Every structure, every pathway felt intentional. But that wasn't the most shocking part. There were no signs of kings, no massive palaces dominating the skyline, no statues screaming the names of rulers into eternity, no evidence of a single man controlling millions. Instead, there was balance. A system so refined, it functioned without visible power, as if the people themselves were the system. Trade routes stretched across distant lands, connecting them to regions thousands of miles away. They were not isolated. They were connected, aware, evolving, and yet, for all their brilliance, they left behind almost no voice, no long written stories, no clear explanation of who they were or how they thought. Just structures, just silence, and that silence is what makes this civilization so disturbing, because it feels less like something that lived and more like something that was never meant to be fully understood. And for centuries, it thrived, stable, unshaken, unchallenged. But beneath that perfection, something had already begun to shift. Quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, the first signs of change. At first, nothing appeared broken. The cities still stood in perfect order. The streets still carried the rhythm of daily life. Children still played in open courtyards. Merchants still moved goods across distant lands. From the outside, everything looked the same. But beneath that surface, the world they depended on was beginning to change. Not violently, not suddenly, but in ways that were almost too subtle to notice at first. The rivers, the lifelines of their civilization, began to behave differently. For generations, these waters had been predictable. They flowed where they were expected, arrived when they were needed, and sustained everything. But now, their patterns were shifting. Some streams grew weaker, others changed direction, slowly carving new paths into the earth. And the people noticed, not as panic, not yet, but as unease. Farmers were the first to feel it. The soil no longer responded the same way. Crops that once grew with certainty now struggled without clear reason. The seasons felt unfamiliar, not dramatically different, just enough to make experience unreliable. And when a civilization is built on precision, even the smallest unpredictability becomes dangerous. Still, There was no collapse, no chaos, no immediate crisis, which made it even more unsettling, because life continued, but confidence did not. Food became less consistent. Surpluses slowly disappeared. Trade routes began to weaken, not because they were destroyed, but because they were no longer dependable. And with that, something invisible began to spread. Doubt, not spoken openly, but felt everywhere. In the way people planned less ahead, in the way communities became slightly quieter, in the way movement slowly increased. Families began to adapt. Some moved closer to stronger water sources. Others left the cities entirely, choosing uncertainty elsewhere over instability at home. And still, there was no single moment anyone could point to, no event that marked the beginning of the end, just a slow, almost silent shift that continued year after year, until one day, what once felt permanent no longer did. And when that realization finally settled in, it didn't create panic. It created something far more dangerous: acceptance. And once a civilization begins to accept change, it cannot control. It doesn't collapse all at once. It begins to fade. And that is exactly what started to happen next. It begins to fade. Not suddenly, not with noise or chaos or destruction, but in a way that is far more unsettling, because it happens quietly, so quietly, that if you were living there at the time, you might not even realize you were witnessing the end of your world. At first, it was just small decisions. A farmer choosing to leave his land, not because it had completely failed, but because it no longer felt certain. A family packing what they could carry, not in fear, but in quiet calculation. A merchant deciding not to return. After one final journey, no one ran, no one screamed, no one gathered to say goodbye, because to them, this wasn't the end. It was simply a change. But changes, repeated over time, become something else entirely. The streets, once filled with movement, began to feel wider, not physically, but emotionally. Spaces that once carried voices now held silence. Shops opened less frequently, markets lost their energy, the rhythm of daily life slowed. And yet, everything was still there. The houses stood exactly as they were built, walls untouched, doors unbroken. Inside those homes, objects remained, tools carefully placed, pottery resting where it had always been, personal belongings left behind without urgency, as if the people who lived there fully expected to return, but they didn't. And that is where the mystery deepens, because when civilizations fall, they leave scars, burned structures, broken defenses, mass graves, evidence of struggle. But here, there is none of that. No violence, no destruction, no final moment captured in chaos. Just absence, layer by layer. The cities emptied, not in a single year, not even in a single generation, but gradually enough that the process itself became invisible. Children who grew up during this time would have seen fewer people than their parents did, and their children even fewer, until one day, a place that once felt alive no longer did. Imagine walking through a city like that, the architecture still perfect, the streets still aligned, the systems still in place, but no voices, no footsteps, no life, only the echo of what used to be. And perhaps the most disturbing part is that no one came back. No one returned to reclaim what was left behind. No attempt to rebuild. No effort to restore what had once worked so perfectly. It was as if the people made a collective, unspoken decision to let it go, to leave everything behind, not because they were forced to, but because something inside them knew it was already over. And when that kind of awareness spreads, a civilization does not fight its end. It accepts it. It walks away from it, slowly, silently, completely, until all that remains are empty cities and questions that no one can answer. And as the last footsteps faded, as the final doors were closed, as the silence became permanent, something else began to take shape, not in the cities, but in the minds of those who left, because leaving a world behind changes you, and whatever they became next, whatever path they chose beyond those abandoned streets, it would ensure one thing, that the civilization they once built would never be seen the same way again. Because when a civilization disappears like this, it does not leave behind answers. It leaves behind questions, questions that echo through centuries, passed from one generation of thinkers to the next, each one trying to make sense of something that refuses to be fully understood. At first, the explanations seemed simple, logical, comforting. Scholars looked at the land, and they saw change. Rivers that once fed entire cities had shifted far from their original paths. Water, the foundation of everything, had become unreliable. And so the first theory was born: environmental collapse, a slow transformation of nature itself, forcing people to abandon what they had built. And on the surface, it made sense, because no civilization, no matter how advanced, can survive without water. But the deeper researchers looked, the more complicated it became, because even when rivers shift, people adapt. They dig new channels. They relocate strategically. They fight to preserve what they have. But here, there was no evidence of that struggle, no massive reconstruction effort, no desperate attempts to hold on, only withdrawal. And that is what made this explanation incomplete. So, others turned to a different possibility: trade collapse. This civilization was not isolated. It was connected, deeply connected, to distant regions. Goods moved in and out. Ideas flowed across borders. Their economy depended on these invisible threads. And if those threads broke, the system could weaken, gradually, quietly, until it could no longer sustain itself. Again, it sounded reasonable. But once more, something didn't fit. Because economic decline leaves patterns: inequality, conflict, social breakdown. But in this case, there was no clear evidence of chaos, no sign that people turned against each other, no indication of internal collapse, driven by greed or power, only departure. As if the system didn't explode, it simply lost meaning. And then came another theory: disease. Invisible, unseen, spreading quietly through populations, forcing people to flee. History is filled with such moments. Entire regions emptied, not by war, but by something far more silent. But again, there were problems, because disease leaves traces. Mas gravis, signs of rapid death, evidence of fear, of urgency, of desperation. But here there was none. No sudden death, nor panic. Just a steady, controlled, almost peaceful exit. And that word, peaceful, doesn't belong in most stories of collapse, which is why this one feels different. And so the theories continued: climate change, river shifts, economic decline, disease. Each one offering a piece of the puzzle, but never the whole picture, because something fundamental was missing: human behavior. In every known collapse, people react. They resist. They panic. They fight to survive. But in this case, there is almost no evidence of resistance. And that is what unsettles historians the most, because it suggests something far more complex. something far more difficult to accept. What if they understood something before it was too late? What if the changes they were experiencing were not sudden enough to shock them, but not slow enough to ignore? What if, over time, they realized that the system they had built no longer had a future, and, instead of waiting for disaster, they chose to leave on their own terms, not as victims, but as observers of their own decline? If that is true, then this wasn't a collapse driven by force. It was a transformation driven by awareness, a quiet recognition that something had shifted permanently. And once that realization spreads, it changes everything. Because when people lose belief, not just in survival, but in the future of what they've built, they don't always fight. Sometimes they walk away. And that possibility changes the entire meaning of this story, because it suggests that this civilization did not disappear suddenly. It did not fall in a moment of chaos. It dissolved over time, through decisions that made sense, one by one, to the people living through it, until one day those decisions added up to absence, and what remains today is not the memory of a disaster, but the outline of something that slowly let itself go, which leads to a far more unsettling question. If a civilization this advanced, this organized, this stable, could reach a point where it no longer believed in its own continuation, then what does that say about the systems we live in today? Because the most dangerous collapses are not the ones that arrive with noise. They are the ones that happen quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, until the moment comes when leaving feels easier than staying. And by the time history notices, it's already over. And that is the part of this story that most people try to avoid, because it is easier to believe that something was destroyed than to accept that it was abandoned, not out of weakness, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because if this civilization truly saw what was coming, if they truly recognized that their world could not continue the way it was, then their disappearance becomes something entirely different. It becomes intentional. And that idea is deeply uncomfortable, because it forces us to see them not as victims of history, but as participants in their own ending. Imagine living in a world like that, a world that appears stable, but no longer feels sustainable, where everything still functions, but something deeper feels misaligned, not broken, just no longer right. And that feeling cannot be measured. It doesn't appear in structures. It doesn't leave marks in the soil. It doesn't show itself in ruins, but it spreads quietly from person to person, a subtle awareness that what once worked no longer does. And when enough people begin to feel that, something shifts, not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because civilizations are not just built on systems, they are built on belief. Belief that tomorrow will be better. Belief that staying is worth it. Belief that what exists has a future. And when that belief begins to fade, everything else follows. Not with violence, not with collapse, but with choice. People begin to rethink their lives, not in panic, but in reflection. They look at their surroundings, their work, their routines, and they begin to ask questions. Questions that don't have easy answers. Questions like, is this still worth continuing? Is this where my future exists? Or is it somewhere else, beyond this place? And when those questions begin to appear, they don't disappear. They grow, slowly, quietly, until they become impossible to ignore. And one by one, people begin to act, not together, not as a coordinated movement, but individually. A decision here, a departure there, a shift so small it barely registers at first. But over time, those small decisions begin to connect, like drops of water, forming a current, until that current becomes impossible to stop. And that is how a civilization can disappear without ever collapsing, because collapse is loud. It demands attention. It forces reaction. But disappearance is different. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't create a moment in time where everything changes. Instead, it stretches across years, decades, even generations. So slowly, that no single person can say exactly when it began or when it ended. Only that, at some point, what once existed no longer did. And what makes this even more profound is that the people who left may not have felt like they were abandoning anything. To them, they were simply moving forward, adapting, searching for something more stable, more certain, more aligned with what they believed their future should be. And in doing so, they carried pieces of their civilization with them. Not the buildings, not the cities, but the knowledge, the habits, the ways of thinking that had once defined their world. And those pieces did not disappear. They blended, they merged into other cultures, other societies, other systems, until they became unrecognizable, until what was once a distinct civilization became part of something larger, something harder to trace. And that is why we cannot find them, not because they vanished completely, but because they changed so gradually, so seamlessly, that history lost the ability to follow them. They didn't leave behind a clear ending. They left behind a transition, a movement from one identity into another. And that kind of transformation is almost impossible to capture, because history is built on events, on moments, on things that can be recorded. But this was not a moment. It was a process, a slow unraveling of identity, followed by a quiet reconstruction somewhere else. And that raises a question, far more unsettling than any theory of collapse. What if civilizations are not meant to last forever? What if their true purpose is not permanence, but evolution? To rise, to develop, to reach a point of complexity, and then to transform into something new, not through destruction, but through movement, through change, through the willingness to leave behind what no longer works. If that is true, then this civilization did not fail. It completed its cycle. It reached a point where staying no longer made sense. And so, it chose a different path. A path that cannot be fully traced. A path that left behind cities, but carried forward ideas. A path that erased its physical presence, but preserved its influence, in ways we may never fully understand. And perhaps that is the real reason this story feels so mysterious, because it doesn't give us a clear ending. It gives us something far more complex, a reminder that disappearance is not always the same as destruction. Sometimes it is transformation, and transformation is much harder to see, much harder to accept, and far more difficult to prove. But the deeper we look, the more it begins to feel like the only explanation that truly fits. And if that is the explanation that fits, then this story is no longer just about them. It becomes about us. Because once you begin to see their disappearance as a process, not a moment, you start to notice something unsettling. Patterns, not identical, not obvious, but familiar, because every civilization, no matter how advanced, no matter how powerful, is built on the same invisible foundation: stability, predictability, and most importantly, belief. The belief that the system will continue, the belief that tomorrow will follow the same rules as today, the belief that what has worked will keep working. And for a long time, that belief holds everything together. Cities grow, trade expands, knowledge increases. Everything appears to be moving forward. But beneath that movement, there is always something else, something quieter, something harder to detect. Change. Not the kind of change that announces itself, but the kind that accumulates, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And that is where the danger begins. Not when systems break, but when they begin to drift. Because drift is silent, it doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't create urgency. It doesn't force immediate action. It simply alters the direction over time. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the more difficult it becomes to correct. This is what may have happened to them. Not a single failure, not a sudden collapse, but a gradual misalignment between the world they had built and the world they were now living in. The rivers changed, the climate shifted, trade patterns weakened, but none of these things were catastrophic on their own. Each one was manageable, adaptable, survivable, and that is precisely what made them dangerous. Because when challenges are small, they are often ignored. When changes are gradual, they are often accepted. And when acceptance becomes normal, action becomes rare. So the system continues, outwardly stable, internally shifting, until eventually it reaches a point where the original structure no longer matches reality. And at that point, there are only two paths. You fight to preserve what exists, or you begin to move away from it. And what makes this civilization unique is that there is almost no evidence that they chose to fight. No large-scale resistance. No desperate attempts to rebuild what was changing. No clear signs of conflict over resources. Instead, there is movement, quiet, steady, uncoordinated, yet consistent. And that suggests something profound. It suggests that the people within this civilization did not see the situation as something to be resisted. They saw it as something to be accepted. Not immediately, not without thought, but gradually, as reality made itself impossible to deny. And that kind of acceptance does not come from weakness. It comes from awareness, from observation, from the ability to recognize that certain systems, no matter how well they once worked, are no longer aligned with the conditions around them. And when that realization spreads, it changes behavior. People stop investing in the long-term future of that system. They stop building for permanence. They stop believing in continuity. And once belief disappears, the system begins to lose its foundation, not physically, but psychologically, and that is where true collapse begins. Not in the walls, not in the infrastructure, but in the minds of the people who sustain it, because a civilization is not its buildings, it is its people. And when enough people begin to think differently, to act differently, to move differently, the structure itself becomes irrelevant. It remains standing, but it is no longer alive. And that is exactly what we see here. Cities that remain intact. Systems that still function, in theory, but no one left to use them. No one left to believe in them. And that raises a question that is far more important than understanding what happened. The question is, could it happen again? Not in the same way. Not with the same conditions, but through the same process. Slow change, gradual drift, increasing misalignment, and eventual acceptance. Because the truth is, we often imagine collapse as something dramatic, something visible, something that arrives with warning signs we cannot ignore. But history suggests something else, that the most significant transformations often happen quietly, without announcement, without clear boundaries, until the moment comes when, looking back, we realize that something fundamental has already changed, and we cannot return to what once was. This is the lesson hidden in their silence. Not a story of destruction, but a story of transition. A reminder that systems do not always end with force. Sometimes they end with movement, with people choosing different paths, with priorities shifting, with belief slowly fading, until what once held everything together no longer exists. And when that happens, there is no single moment to mark the end, no clear line between before and after, only a gradual realization that the world has changed and that the old version of it is gone, not destroyed, not erased, but left behind. And, perhaps, that is why this civilization continues to unsettle us, because it does not fit the narratives we are comfortable with. It does not give us a clear enemy. It does not offer a simple cause. It forces us to confront something more complex, that the greatest changes, the ones that reshape entire worlds, may not come from outside forces, but from within, from the decisions people make when they begin to see things differently. And once that shift begins, it cannot be undone, only followed, until the system that once defined everything becomes just another chapter in the long, quiet story of change. And when change reaches that point, when it has moved so far, so deeply, that returning becomes impossible, something else begins to happen, not outside, but inside, because once a civilization is left behind, it does not disappear immediately from memory. It lingers, in fragments, in echoes, in the quiet spaces where something once existed, but no longer does. Imagine standing in one of those abandoned cities, the air still, the structures untouched, walls that once held voices, now holding silence. You walk through streets that were once filled with movement, and you feel something difficult to explain. Not fear, not exactly sadness, but a kind of presence, as if the past has not fully let go. Because even when people leave, they leave something behind. Not just objects, not just buildings, but intention. Every structure was built with purpose. Every street designed with meaning. Every space shaped by human thought. And that does not disappear overnight. It remains imprinted into the environment long after the people are gone. And yet, without those people, those intentions lose their function. A house is no longer a home. A street is no longer a path. A city is no longer alive. It becomes something else. A memory without a mind to remember it. A system without participants. A world frozen between existence and absence. And that is what makes this story so powerful, because it forces us to confront a reality that we rarely think about. That everything we build, everything we believe to be permanent, everything we assume will continue, depends entirely on our decision to remain within it. The moment that decision changes, everything changes. And this civilization, at some point, made that decision, not in a single moment, not through a leader, not through force, but through countless individual realizations that slowly aligned until they became a collective movement. And once that movement reached a certain point, there was no going back, because returning would require something very specific. Belief. Belief that what was left behind was still worth rebuilding. Belief that the system could be restored. Belief that the future still existed in that place. But clearly, that belief was gone. And without belief, there is no reason to return, only a reason to continue moving forward. And that is exactly what they did. They moved, not as a unified group, not as a migrating civilization, but as individuals, families, small communities, each carrying pieces of their past into places that would eventually reshape them. And over time, those pieces changed, adapted, merged with new environments, new cultures, new systems, until the original identity became impossible to recognize. And that is why we cannot find them, not because they disappeared completely, but because they no longer exist in the form we are searching for. They are not lost, they are transformed. And transformation is invisible to those who are looking for endings, because it does not leave behind a clear line. It does not create a moment of finality. It continues, quietly, across time, until the original form is only a distant memory. And even that memory begins to fade, until all that remains are fragments, artifacts, ruins, clues that hint at something greater, but never fully reveal it. And that is where we stand today, looking at the remains of something extraordinary, trying to reconstruct a story that was never meant to be fully understood, because, perhaps, the purpose of this civilization was not to leave behind answers, but to leave behind questions, questions that force us to think, to reflect, to look beyond the surface of history and into the deeper patterns that shape human existence. Because in the end, this is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror, a reflection of how systems rise, how they stabilize, how they drift, and how they eventually change, not always through destruction, not always through collapse, but through something far more subtle, the gradual shift of human perception. And if there is one thing this story teaches us, it is this, that the greatest endings are not always marked by noise. They are marked by silence, by absence, by the quiet realization that something has already ended, long before anyone noticed. And maybe that is why this civilization still matters, not because of what it was, but because of what it reveals. That permanence is an illusion, that stability is temporary, and that even the most advanced societies are only as strong as the belief that holds them together. And once that belief begins to fade, everything else follows. Not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably, until one day, what once defined an entire world becomes nothing more than a story, a mystery, a question, echoing through time. And perhaps that is exactly what they became. Not a lost civilization, but a message, a quiet, enduring reminder that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form. And whether we understand it or not, that change is always happening, even now. And maybe that is the real reason this story still stays with us. Not because we are trying to find them, but because, in a way, we recognize something familiar in their silence. A civilization that did not end with fire, did not collapse in chaos, did not leave behind a final moment we could point to, but simply faded. And if something that powerful, that advanced, that stable, could disappear without a clear ending, then it leaves us with a question we cannot ignore. What truly holds a civilization together? Is it its structures, its systems, its knowledge, or is it something far more fragile, something we cannot see, but only feel? Because once that invisible foundation begins to weaken, everything else eventually follows. And perhaps that is why their story was never meant to be fully solved, because it is not just a mystery of the past, it is a reflection of the present, and a quiet warning for the future. If you found yourself thinking differently after this story, if something about it stayed with you, then take a moment. Look around your world and ask yourself, what feels permanent today that may not be tomorrow? And before you leave, tell me in the comments, do you believe they truly disappeared? Or did they simply change and become something else? Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that give us answers. They are the ones that stay with us long after they end.